He's not going to self-censor. He's going to say what he wants. I think that's admirable, but why is he choosing to say these things in these ways with such lack of clarity and specificity? You can see that it's impacting his personal brand. What the hell is going on?
This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. You might know that sinking feeling. You're about to land a big contract when they ask about compliance. SOC 2, ISO, PCI, Essential 8. You've just snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Not anymore. Vanta massively accelerates your compliance efforts and allows you to get those life-changing deals back on track. Don't wait until it's panic stations, though. Get started with Vanta today. They're offering 20% off their prices just for TSP listeners. Do yourself a favor. Hit pause, go to vanta.com/TSP, that's VANTA.com, to get that 20% off.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is a Reacts episode. Industry insiders having frank debates about the latest tech, politics, and business news. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into how current events connect to broader themes and trends that impact your startup, your investments, and your day-to-day operational decisions. The conversation starts now.
All right, welcome to another Reacts episode. How's it going, Emil?
Going great. Good to be here again.
Yaniv, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. Excited to jump in. We've got a good set of things to discuss, so I'm champing at the bit.
On today's episode, we're going to discuss Elon telling advertisers to go fuck themselves and the implications of paid social media, and especially its impact on young companies and e-commerce and direct-to-consumer businesses. What does this mean for small companies trying to make a dent in the universe? We're going to discuss EVs. Have we built too much too fast, and is the market rejecting the product? What does this mean for climate change? And what alternative technology strategies might actually help the looming climate catastrophe? First up on the agenda is Elon Musk telling advertisers to go fuck themselves on the New York Times Deal Book stage when asked about advertisers fleeing the platform thanks to his shenanigans and his tweets, probably most specifically one that was deemed anti-Semitic, which I think was anti-Semitic, actually. His attitude was, I don't want to talk about that, they can fuck off. And he connected it to blackmail. They're blackmailing him with money. I think he felt quite indignant about that, given that he's got a lot of money. And he felt like this was somehow a double standard. They're not leaving Instagram because of the content on Instagram. He doesn't seem to want to acknowledge or admit that this is about his personal behavior, his personal reputation on the platform, and increasingly more broadly. What do you guys make of this behavior? And let's connect it to the changing business model, right? Facebook announced paid Facebook as an experiment in certain countries. Elon is certainly trying to move X, I don't want to call it X, but X to paid. How does this all play out and play together?
Well, so you didn't mention that he walked back that post that was causing the controversy. He said it was the worst post he's ever made. He regrets it and so on.
Does that matter?
I mean, of course it matters to say that this person who's done 50,000 tweets has done something that we think has crossed the line, that he walked back. And that's the reason why all these companies are pulling back advertising. Yeah, it kind of matters. Why wouldn't it matter? It's not like he's a repeat offender of this notion.
But I guess that is my point.
I would say he is a repeat offender.
Of this notion, anti-Semitic tweets?
He associates himself with a lot of anti-Semitic Twitter accounts and, accounts that are generally, I guess you'd say, hard right and affiliated with that world. Yeah, so I think this was just the latest. He also threatened to sue the Jewish Anti-Defamation League not that long ago for encouraging advertisers to leave the platform. So I think that's the thing, is it wasn't this wild, out of character as like, I'm a nice guy and then, I don't know, I took too much ketamine or something and I posted this. It was in character, and it's maybe like he was coming closer and closer to the line and then he stepped over it, but like he didn't just magically find himself on the wrong side of the line.
In my mind, this isn't just about anti-Semitism. It's about his increasing trollish behavior, his carelessness. If you are purporting to want to buy, own, and nurture the town square, nurture free speech, and you are the lead troll on that platform, doesn't that really undermine your stated goal? It's one thing to reduce shadow banning and reduce curation towards certain, I think he would argue, liberal values, whatever. That's one thing, is to let everyone say what they want to say. It's another for you to be the most trollish person on the platform. That just feels, at best counterproductive, at worst toxic and destructive to his personal brand and to the platform's brand.
I have three things to say. Number one, so the ADL now defended Elon, and the ADL is advertising on Twitter. They made up after this dispute. He went to Israel. The president of Israel showed him around. So, some other prominent Jewish and Israeli people don't think he's anti-Semite, so we might want to consider their opinion. But number two, however he behaves on Twitter, you could be mad about that. You have a right not to advertise. That's for sure. No one owes you. So that I disagree with him on. But also the people who don't advertise also have competing platforms. Disney is an advertiser too. Like they sell ads on their ABC network. So maybe there's some competitive issue there. When General Motors pulls their ads, do I think it's just because of Elon or because of a Tesla? Like he's got a lot of interests and people could be mad at him for a lot of reasons, not just what he tweets. And he may be suffering from just being prominent in so many areas and people just being competitors to him or their own ad networks or angry with him for some tweet on some other topic. But like he's generating controversy, which generates tweets, which generates views.
And that's the thing. Like, I feel like he's trying to have his cake and eat it too. Like, I'm not really interested in the is he or isn't he anti-Semitic debate. I don't think that's really the point here. The point here is that free speech ain't free, right? If you own Twitter and you own a bunch of competing interests and you do things that make Twitter a less pleasant place for advertisers to be, then there are consequences to that. And you can't really be upset at anyone but yourself if you're not happy with those consequences, right? It's one of those things like, yes, he has generated tremendous engagement. He is like vaulted to the top of the zeitgeist in the same way that Donald Trump used the same platform a few years earlier. And it's like, it generates enormous power, but it also means that you have now got this very powerful weapon in your hand. And, if you're not careful, you cut yourself. And that's all that's happened here. So I think it's very childish of him to get stroppy when the use of his platform has led to consequences, because free speech was never about not having consequences for your speech.
I want to go a little deeper here. Firstly, Emil, you're raising the idea, and I like this, it's counter narrative. You're raising the idea that there may be ulterior motives to these advertisers pulling out. I think that's an important thing to explore because to me, that's never occurred to me. It feels entirely causally linked that there are a lot of people who are competitive in some ways and cooperative in other ways in the world, right? And this feels like the 10th or 20th reason for a Disney or a GM to pull out of Twitter. I'd love to unpack that a little bit. And the other thing that I would like to unpack that I think nobody's unpacking enough is like, why is he doing this? And, people are making flippant comments about mental health, ketamine. I think he would argue, just observing him, that he does not want to be censored or canceled, and he thinks he's too important and too successful to allow that to happen to him. So he's not going to self-censor. He's going to say what he wants. I think that's admirable, but why is he choosing to say these things in these ways with such lack of clarity and specificity? He can see that it's impacting his personal brand. Is it just down to mental health? What the hell is going on?
I mean, he said he believes there's a woke mind virus. He believes that a lot of DEI and its offshoots, critical race theory, those things he disagrees with, and he is vocal about that. You may call that right wing. He's saying a lot of those things, and yes, maybe that upsets people on the other side of the equation. But I think he believes those things and he wants to use the platform to promote his ideas. I mean, I don't think it's a mental health issue. He just thinks that. So, but your question is like, well, but he's losing advertisers because of it. And I think he just values saying what he wants more than he values the advertising dollars.
Yeah, that much is clear. But I think there are aspects of the woke movement broadly that can be classified as a kind of mind virus, as a kind of self-censorship, as a kind of polarization of the discourse that's not helpful. And I think there's lots of this stuff that's happening on the extreme left and middle left that feels overreaching, overwrought, overly generalized, poorly framed, all very reasonable things that I would agree with personally. But I think there are thoughtful, nuanced ways of saying those things. And when you are the richest person on the planet owning one of the most important platforms on the planet, one would imagine that you might go to some trouble to saying those things more carefully, especially if your stated goal is to curate the town square, to engender a kind of democracy-preserving conversation. Doesn't it seem at odds? The style, let's put aside the substance, the style of his engagement is undermining his very large investment in this important platform and very large bet that he wants to protect free speech. It seems utterly chaotic and at odds with the goal.
I just don't agree. I mean, it may feel that way to people who are very left, But Twitter, before he owned it, felt very left to people who are on the right? They're like, well, even Jack's tweets, maybe they weren't as sort of explosive in nature and as provocative, but Twitter felt like a place for lefty journalists to like cancel people and Twitter mobs, I mean, for saying the wrong thing and so on. So I feel like maybe this reaction to what Twitter's become is just relative to what it was. But in general, I don't think it's an overly toxic place. It's like, it's always been a kind of nasty place. And it's just like less left nasty now, in my view.
I don't want to sort of get drawn into a left-right debate here, but Chris talked about the town square, right? You don't get a town square if you're putting your thumb on the scales this hard. If you are the loudest voice in the town square that you own, then it's not really a town square. It's your own platform that you've platformed yourself on. And I think the fact that Elon is highly partisan, whether you agree with his partisanship or not, whether you agree there's a woke mind virus or not, I don't think anybody who is the subject of part of this so-called woke mind virus, it's a term I detest, is going to be convinced to change their views by being told that they're victims of a woke mind virus. This is not how you change minds. This is how you build tribalism. And so if you own the town square and you're creating a tribal cult around yourself on your own town square, it ain't a town square anymore.
Yeah, that's the thing that I'm most interested in discussing is the architecture of this, right? It's not his personal beliefs. It's not his opinions. It's he's trying to solve energy. He's trying to solve multi-planet life. He's trying to solve traffic, I guess, with boring. And he's trying to solve the computer mind interface. These are lofty goals with civilization moving implications. And Twitter, the stated goal of buying Twitter was to put it in that same league, to treat it as the nervous system of democracy, to protect and preserve our conversation and our discourse. And in all of these companies, with all of these missions, you pretty much need to take a kind of statesman role. You're kind of the president of saving the world. And I agree with you, Yaniv, which is like, in that context, you don't get to be the commander-in-chief of the troll army. I think it really is at odds with your goal. And I guess I don't understand his calculation. Again, I really resonate with the idea of like, don't allow yourself to be self-censored. You know, we've talked about this on the podcast even. I've personally talked about this idea of the extreme left and the absolutism that can silence debate and silence people and mob justice. These things have really earth-shattering consequences that need to be confronted.
I totally disagree with both you and Elon. I think Elon is a national treasure. He should be on Mount Rushmore. His style may not be sort of what Bob Iger did on that same stage, but it worked at Tesla and SpaceX. Maybe it doesn't work at Twitter. I don't know. But whatever he does, it's working. I want him to keep going until he doesn't stop for civilization purposes. I think I disagree on a bit. I feel like, has he caused more tribalism? No, I think he has influenced the demise of some of the worst ideas of the left that were prominent. Defund the police. Some of these things which just went overside. Now he's galvanized the other side to say that's crazy. There's another half of the country that doesn't think that way. And they're going to have a voice. You have New York Times and you have BuzzFeed and all these things. Well, here's a place at Twitter where we're going to have conservative voices. So I guess I'm more willing to give the benefit of the doubt to his style. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But who else would you trust in that job? I do want to say one last thing, which you said, but it's important to note that, but I agree where it makes me agree with you is that it is true that anti-Semitism, it seems way more virulent based on the stats I've read on TikTok. And yet those same brands haven't announced we're not advertising on TikTok. So I do think it's about Elon. The reason why Disney and these things, people aren't advertising on Twitter, it's not about anti-Semitism.
He's made himself the story.
So that is the thing. And it would be interesting to see if a retaliation is like, okay, well, I'm no longer selling Teslas to Disney employees, or I don't know what the retaliation is. No Starlink for Bob Iger's in Beverly Hills.
There's serious geopolitical implications there because he did have to say no Starlink for Gaza,
Yeah.
right? So he did have to go do an apology tour, whatever he says. He had to go do that. And he's now had geopolitical implications because he now has to make promises about what happens with Starlink and other resources for Gaza. Like, it's serious. It's serious stuff. Let's maybe start connecting it back to business. We also could spend hours talking about the choices he's made on the product side. I think he's very good at engineering rockets. He's not good at engineering social networks. Let's put aside that as well. Let's talk about the broader trend of turning these platforms, which were once considered to be free with advertising on top, And there's now seems to be a concerted movement, I think in some ways led by Elon, but also by Patreon and OnlyFans and YouTube subscriptions and other paid media, Substack even, where there's now an increasing expectation that you pay for your social media, you pay for your media, you pay for your services. Meta recently announced that Facebook and Instagram are going to offer subscriptions for no ads in Europe. It's probably partly connected to the European laws and GDPR. It's hard to track people, hard to monetize them, and it's partly connected, I think, to this broader trend of paying for what you get. Is that part of what gives Elon the confidence to say that kind of thing? And what do we think about a paid-for internet?
I do think even from day one, Elon's thought about how to reduce the necessity for advertising on X. That first started with the blue checks. How do I charge for them? And then it's moved to how do I charge corporations? Is it going to be a payment platform? How do I move away from these advertising notions? Because the world is, especially the EU, on the privacy stuff, on the data stuff. It's just becoming increasingly hard to navigate that landscape of user data. So this is a way to potentially get out of it for Facebook, for all these companies. So I do think that's a trend we're going to see because it's just hard to comply. And the fines are really significant if you mess this up in your social network. Billions of dollars in the new law from the EU. So I do think we're seeing a shift there. There'll be lots of experiments there, and there probably should be.
I think this is both mostly a good thing and inevitable. I think the world has actually always, to a certain extent, been divided between those who can pay and those who are exposed to advertising, right? Like basically the business model calculus here is every user needs to bring in revenue, right? When you're dealing with media, there's two ways you can bring in revenue. One is advertising and the other is direct subscription payments. And there's nothing new about this sort of balance and this swinging pendulum between mostly it's subscriber payments. Subscriptions are not new, right? Newspapers, magazines goes back to the 19th century, if not before. And then advertising on the other hand. I think often you end up reaching this equilibrium point where it's like, okay, you have some mix of subscription payment and advertising, and that adds up to a viable business. Now, what's changed, as often changes on the internet, is you can customize that ratio, in a sense, for every individual person. With newspapers, you had to say, okay, this is how much it costs, and this is how much ad load it bears, right? Same with TV. But now you can say, well, you can pay a lot and get no ads, or pay a little bit and get some ads, or pay nothing and get lots of ads. And that's just the way it's going to go. And there's, in a sense, like I said, there's nothing new about that. It's just more custom at scale. I also think for whatever reason, subscription has had a slow start on the internet in terms of media. Again, probably because those advertising engines were so powerful early on. There was so much money being made. Like, why would you want to kill that goose that laid the golden egg? But now there's time to segment. People are sick of ads. People with money will pay to not have ads. And, really interesting to see. If you look at Netflix and other streaming media providers, it's going the other direction, right? They started subscription only. Now they have ad-supported tiers. So there's just a convergence. There are historical reasons why these media platforms started in different places. But in the end, you're going to have a bunch of different tiers that are going to be like lots of ads, no ads, or maybe something in between.
Yeah, I agree. It's going to end up being a spectrum, but I think this has second order effect that I don't think is being discussed enough, which is that highly targeted precision advertising has been the backbone of the explosion in the B2C and direct commerce ecosystem. It has been the substrate on top of which a lot of innovation has been created and distributed and monetized. I think this is really, really important because if I can't build an app and find my users with inorganic reach, especially affluent users who are moving to the paid tiers, what does that mean for a startup who's trying to launch and acquire their first users with paid ads?
It's a good question. I mean, remember when Apple made their privacy change? The dramatic effect it had on small businesses because it was default do not track on Apple, and Facebook went through a couple tough quarters. It's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. I guess if you're trying to start out and affluent users close off, how do you get to them? That is a question I don't have an answer to.
Yeah, because this is, I think, part of a couple of headwinds that startups are facing. There's an argument to be made whether AI helps startups and helps democratize value creation, or it concentrates it at the big tech companies with the big tools and the big data sets. Maybe there's a tension that cancels out and maybe the world just keeps humming along on the AI side. But then on the ad side, again, it actually advantages large companies who have the existing users, the existing reach, existing distribution. And I think the EU and Apple and others who are participating and cheerleading on this idea of don't track me, bro, it's like, you're actually disadvantaging young entrepreneurs and companies in a really serious way.
Yeah.
And I don't think they've thought through those unintended consequences enough. And I think as founders and investors, we need to think through this pretty seriously. It really undermines the ability for the young companies and young entrepreneurs to reach new heights, I think.
Just advertise on Twitter, guys.
Yaniv, I got a package in the mail. Maybe we should blur that out. I purchased the very first merch from our store, and I'm going to open it up live on camera and see what it's like. Have a live reaction to this thing.
Better not suck, Chris. This could be the worst ad ever. Oh, you got the super ultra premium one, the one that marks you out as TSP royalty.
The super exclusive one. This one's a little more expensive than all the others for good reason. It's bold and it's brash and it's using the Startup Podcast orange. And actually, you'll notice up here, it says Startup Podcast Edition 1.
Ooh.
That is not going to happen on any other drop. And on the back, it has a big ass logo. All the other ones are more subtle in this, but this one is if you're a really loud and proud fan.
All right. Well, now you better put it on, Chris.
I'm not taking my shirt off on camera. I'm sorry. That's not happening.
Oh, come now. That's how we're going to grow subscribers.
But maybe the next episode I'll be wearing that. Check it out. It's at shop.tsp.show. This was the very first one. We've had actually quite a few orders. I was a bit surprised about the number of orders we've had. So we have limited numbers of this edition 1 drop. Please get in there and check them out. Buy the last few, and then we'll start to rotate and shift them as we go along. That's at shop.tsp.show.
It looks nice. It looks nice. I better order one too. This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. The team at Vanta are passionate about helping you secure your business by vastly cutting down on the time to get compliant with frameworks like ISO 27001, SOC 2, and Essential 8. Vanta lets you close deals, sleep better at night, and get back to building your product. Help yourself and help the podcast by going to vanta.com/TSP for an exclusive 20% off deal. But no, I mean, it's a really interesting point. And Emil, like you mentioned, we got a preview of this with Apple's Do Not Track, because apart from anything else, that actually is a very nice proxy for a wealthier cohort as well, because it was only iPhones, and iPhones are for rich people on a global scale. There was an interesting thing, right? Like, it didn't work out well for a while. Like, the conversion rates dropped, the cost of acquisitions went up, and then, like, the big advertising platforms figured out how to adapt, and things are kind of ish back to normal. And so I'm inclined to agree with you. I'm not just trying to be contrarian. I'm inclined to agree with you that this is an interesting issue that will tend to accrue power to incumbents. I do think, though, that advertising and this sort of thing, it is a game of cat and mouse. It's an arms race, right? People's eyeballs are always precious, and there will always be attempts to shut down overly intrusive forms of advertising. Again, that is not new. And then they will come up with new formats and new ways of providing advertising, right? Like, do we start to see killer product placement in VR and AR applications, for example? I don't know where the next frontier is, but when there are valuable eyeballs, advertisers will find ways to reach those eyeballs. That is kind of my meta view without having any real specific examples.
No, I think that's generally true. The point, I think, is if it becomes harder, and now I need an agency and I need creativity and I need campaign, we're back to Madison Avenue. Whereas Facebook allowed anyone to just quickly hyper-target very cost-effectively, and it democratized access and reach. Back in the day, I used to say, founders would come to me and say, oh, we have to partner with this distribution partner because they have all the users. And I would kind of say, that's bullshit. They don't have all the users. That's legacy thinking. Everyone's on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and TikTok. You can reach those users too. You don't have to pay for that database or partner with that company. You can disrupt them. But it's now becoming a little more true. This ownership is reclaiming itself. And yeah, it's problematic. All right, let's switch gears. The next topic we wanted to discuss is EVs. Emil, you brought this one up. You want to set us up for a conversation about it?
Yeah. So two things happened in the last couple of months that maybe are relevant in the news. One, during the auto strike, and the reason this was the longest auto strike by unions against the US auto companies lasted so long was because not only of the increase in pay that was requested, but because that conflicted with the huge investment plans that these companies had for electric vehicles. And I think what's happened after that, Ford announced that they're pulling back big time on their EV investments. And a bunch of dealerships have pulled back and said, we don't want to carry EVs anymore because they're not selling well. And so what's interesting about that to me is that we just had the bill that was passed a couple of years ago, the Inflation Reduction Act, bullshit name, but that gave $9,000 subsidies to electric vehicles. And even with that, the companies and dealerships are saying we can't sell these. And I think it's a very interesting time because California has said we're no longer going to allow sale of combustible engine vehicles by 2035. That's 11 years from now. And so you kind of wonder, have we gone too far down this path and the world's not ready for it? And frankly, the auto companies aren't ready for it. Tesla, in my view, is not an electric car company. It's just a car company that makes great cars. The Ford 150s and all these electric vehicles that the other ones have put are bunk. They've been recalled 100 times. I can't sell them. They're overpriced. The batteries don't work. They have to go through several cycles. So I just wonder if we've gone a little mad on electric vehicles and a little way light on nuclear power as the solve to climate change question.
Well, I think we've definitely gone light on nuclear power. Bill Gates and others have talked about how the nuclear power plants that we have in operation or had in operation are ancient technology, and we have cutting edge stuff that's way safer, way cleaner, way more effective, and produces just crap tons of energy. And I think just because of pure dogma and fear, we're not adopting the technology that could be very helpful. I'm curious, what is the main reason that these EVs are becoming less popular? One of the data points, by the way, I have is I'm a huge Porsche fan, and Taycan prices have plummeted. They've just cratered. No one wants to buy a secondhand Taycan. And I had an instinct about that. I was buying a Porsche at the time, and I got hassled online, like, why didn't you buy an electric Porsche? And why didn't you buy the Taycan? And I had this sense that, like, buying a Taycan was like buying the first iPhone or the first car phone, right? It's like, that thing is going to plummet in value. Whereas if I buy the last 911, that's going to go up in value. And so I think that's probably playing out as well. But what is the core reason that EV demand has softened, do we think? Is that just because the products are crap?
I think the products are crap relative to the price, even with the subsidies.
So it's a return on investment.
Yeah. So the subsidies were made to cross the chasm. This car costs $10,000 more to build. So let's give the consumer $10,000 credit, and therefore they're paying the same price for an equivalent vehicle. Turns out those just aren't equivalent vehicles. Like you said, they're early models. People still have range anxiety. You hear these stories about the charging stations get backed up, you know where to charge it. People haven't said these are great cars and I want to buy them if pound for pound I could get a combustible one at the same price, same net price.
I mean, Elon's argument, to go back to Elon, is that people are still buying great cars. And you just mentioned this as well. It's just Tesla just makes great cars, not great EVs. And they'll just keep buying great cars, irrespective of whether they're EV or combustion. I can tell you, having advised a charging station manufacturing company, I think one of the largest in the world, Tritium, they were hyper aware of just how bad the charging station problem is outside of the Tesla network. There's incompatibilities, payment problems, maintenance problems, locations, findability, lines, charging times. It is a terrible, terrible experience. And I think it's gone a little bit better with Electrify America and other networks, but I don't think as good as the Tesla network. I think the charging network is part of the product.
Yeah.
It's the part of the network effect. And I think that's been ill considered in many of these
Yeah.
manufacturers.
Yeah, Emil, I think you're completely right to mention crossing the chasm. I think that is exactly what's happening here, right? We've got all of our early adopters and so on. Like, they've already bought their EV, and then everyone else is still just not quite convinced. I'm not sure it's true that they're crappier cars, but I think what's true is, yes, things like range anxiety, insufficient infrastructure, right? You get all these futuristic views of, like, gas stations can be replaced with these charging stations with, like, fabulous restaurants, and you just have a wonderful experience and water slides and whatever, but they don't exist. Right. And so there's a lot of that happening. I also think legacy manufacturers are playing a funny game, right? Because, yeah, their expertise is in internal combustion. So at one level, they're disrupting themselves. At another, they're probably kind of afraid to disrupt themselves. I imagine there's a lot of divergent thinking within these companies, and they shoot themselves in the foot. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a level of, like, FUD, like deliberate fear, uncertainty, and doubt around range anxiety that the ICE manufacturers are actually creating. But I just wanted to throw one other thing into the mix that I feel is a little bit of a sleeper, which is China. There's a car company called BYD, which has a much, much, much lower profile than Tesla. But last quarter, I believe, they shipped within 1,000 units of Tesla. They are growing incredibly fast. And like with a lot of other things, China, it doesn't have the industrial legacy. They could never quite build great internal combustion cars. They do not have that problem with electric cars. They've got a supply chain stitched up. They can do things at lower cost. And these BYD vehicles are apparently pretty good. And they've got their own subsidies, their own domestic market. And so my prediction here is that Tesla's competition is not going to come from legacy car manufacturers. It's going to come from China. And like with a lot of things, I do think that that is actually what we're going to see. We're already seeing it on the roads here in Australia. I don't know what it's like where you are, Emil, but I see as many BYDs as I see Teslas. They're becoming increasingly visible.
Yeah, BYDs are banned in the US.
What, really?
So Yeah. So
Why?
you're right. They're an enormous company, very successful in Europe, Eurasia, and China. But the US has specifically kept those out. And by the way, the other thing China has is the core materials for batteries and the ability to process them. So
Hmm.
they have sort of some natural advantages that we don't have in the US on batteries, which is why Elon built a battery factory out there.
Yep. So yeah, I do think China will actually be the thing, and and they've got a central government subsidizing the industry for geopolitical reasons. That will be the thing that crosses the chasm. I think this is a sort of Apple Android story, right? Tesla will be Apple, BYD and their ilk from China will be Android, and everyone will make the transition. I think.
Yeah, Elon Musk on stage said that there are some commentators, take this with a grain of salt, but some commentators think it'll be Tesla number one and 9 Chinese car manufacturers behind him.
I would not be surprised.
Yeah, who knows? But this is yet another example that we've talked about on the podcast many times. New technology platforms and technology eras reshuffle the deck in terms of winners and losers. EV is a fundamentally new platform, and you can see all of the legacy players, dipping their toe in the water and trying to adopt the platform. But it's just as likely, or if not more likely, that new players will come out on top in this new era, which is true for, mobile first and web first and AI first companies. These will all reshuffle the deck in terms of winners and losers. In terms of the quality of the cars, I think we have to be clear, though, kind of a bit of a counter argument to what I just said. This is the first few generations from these legacy manufacturers, right? They rushed to market to try to catch the curve, the wave that Elon created, but they'll get better. I hope they'll get better, and they expect that they'll get better. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that this is the traditional hype cycle, right? There's this peak of high expectations, and now we're maybe in the trough of disillusionment, and eventually it'll just become normal that every car is electric or hybrid, and we'll go on with our day.
Yeah, I just think just like with self-driving cars, it's just going to take a longer than people think. So you're right. Is GM that sold 36 electric cars last year? 36? 36?
Really?
What?
I don't believe that. Chevy Volt was quite popular.
That's what Elon said in Deal Book. We need to fact check that. But yes, are they a few generations and will they get there? Sure, but a car takes 3 years per generation. So if you're a few generations out, then yes, in 2030,
Hmm.
they'll come out with a version that's as good as Tesla is today or a version from today. So it's just, I think you're talking 20 years before this like fully converts. And by the way, who knows if you solve carbon capture by then, maybe this becomes not a thing. Or so many other things can happen that change the need for electric cars, given the length of the time frame that it's just an uncertain place.
You mentioned nuclear, Emil, and one thing that I think has been quite demoralizing is the degree to which all of these debates have become kind of politicized. And,
Yeah.
it's one thing to have politicized debates about politics. It's like, well, okay, sure, if it's about ideas, if it's about ideology. Now we're talking about technology and like what works and what doesn't. And it is alarming to me that you can predict, I would say on both sides of politics, what energy sources and what solutions to climate change you will prefer based on your political affiliation. That is bonkers, right? Like, why should solar be left wing and nuclear be right wing? And why should carbon capture be right wing and hydrogen be left wing? It's like, what is going on here? Like, even nuclear. By the way, podcast recommendation. I'm listening at the moment to Age of Miracles, which is Packy McCormack's podcast, and it's about nuclear. And my feeling on nuclear is I don't have a position yet because the actual evidence being presented is so politically polarized. I feel I don't know what information is accurate. So I'm going to have to go down the do my own research bandwagon just to have an opinion, right? Like, on the one hand, you have people saying, well, nuclear is the solution and the technology is advanced and like what's out there is a stone age and so on. On the other hand, you have people saying, sure, but it's too expensive and too late for this to make a difference. And then you've got the people who are like, oh, well, what about Fukushima? I'm writing those off because that's clearly bonkers. But I think the economic question about whether nuclear can solve the problem, I do not know the answer. And it's filtered through such a partisan political lens. I don't know how to get that answer either. And it's really disturbing.
I mean, I just read that China in the last decade did 46 nuclear reactors, something like that. The thing that I found most convincing, Yaniv, was France versus Germany, where France, and this is sort of a nonpartisan view, they decided a long time ago to make all their power nuclear. So they have like tons of nuclear power plants. They get 100% of their power or something near 100% from nuclear rather than coal. And then Germany has been decommissioning nuclear power plants
It's because, yeah,
because, which caused a dependency on Russian oil in the meantime, which had some relationship to this Ukraine war. You just look at those two and see why they chose, what's expensive, what are the benefits. I lean one way, but it'd be interesting to hear on another podcast what you come up with.
I feel like what Germany did was bonkers, and Japan similarly. I think decommissioning existing plants makes very little sense, especially when you're going to be replacing them with coal, and especially to use an environmentalist argument for that is just absolutely like that's something I'm willing to consider a mind virus for sure. But I think that's not the interesting question, right? Like the really interesting question is not, if we had a time machine, we could go back in time and build out more nuclear, would that have been the right thing to do? The question is, it's 2023. We're playing the game that's on the board right now. Can nuclear be a major part of the solution? I don't feel like that is something that is debated in a sort of clear, fact-based, evidence-based way. It becomes ideological, and then I don't know where to turn. So I think that's really the interesting thing. I'm trying to educate myself.
Whether we can stand up enough nuclear plants safely to kind of catch up to this curve is unknown to me. I need to do more research. But it's clear to me that historically we have been underinvesting in nuclear. But I do think the long-term answer is relatively obvious. There is a giant fusion ball in the sky, just emitting infinite energy. Capturing that efficiently, storing it and serving it seems to me the obvious ultimate answer. The question is only how quickly we can get there and what should we do to backfill in the meantime. We talked about carbon capture making this irrelevant, Emil. You mentioned that. I do think, sadly, it's unlikely that we are going to mitigate the worst of climate change using this green technology. We are way into overtime here in terms of trajectory, and it's clear that we're going to need to rely on technology to try to restore or somehow terraform our own planet back to habitable or more optimized in some way. It is clear that we are going to have to deal with some level of, let's call it even catastrophic or meaningful material climate change that will cause mass migrations and famine and so on. And we're going to have to try to reverse some of it with technology versus mitigate some of it with technology.
Well, did you read the article yesterday about the COPE summit that was in the Middle East? A lot of the countries that the US gave billions of dollars to have them not build coal-fired plants and instead spend on other forms of energy, they've all missed their targets. Developing economies don't care. They're like, we are improving our standard of living in India, in Indonesia, and parts of Africa. You guys had caused the problems, you big Western economies. We're going to do what it takes to fulfill our energy needs. And no matter what we do, that's going to happen. And therefore, all the other stuff we're doing, it's not going to catch up to their continued use of energy in a way that is going to change the trajectory. So I'm agreeing with you. I don't think we should keep trying in the way we're trying.
People seem to hesitate to want to say this
Right.
because it somehow gives us permission to keep burning fossil fuels, or it somehow relieves the pressure, or it's not the right thing to say. And I think this is an example of political correctness, right? I think it is inevitable that this squabbling and this delay is going to cause us to go past the red line. The trajectory is not being bent down and to the right fast enough. And we will need to deal with this in a cleanup fashion. And we're going to have to bet on technology to get us out of this mess and hopefully restore some sanity to the planet after we've completely messed it up. And I don't say that as some excuse for us to give up on EV or give up on clean power or give up on any of the efforts we are making. Those things should continue. And we need to be sober about the reality that it's likely we're going to have to clean up the mess somehow after everything is screwed.
And then maybe just to sort of tie a bow on it and to bring it back to nuclear and solar and whatnot, that is going to require a massive amount of energy. So clean energy abundance feels like it needs to be part of any solution. If we want to beat carbon capture or any sort of terraforming or whatever, like that is energy intensive. And so we better have the means to do that when the time comes.
Yeah, these debates about, is clean energy useful or is energy abundance useful? They're delusional, right? Why would you not want energy that is less pollutive, less reliant on Middle Eastern sources? Anybody arguing against that is really making themselves seem foolish. And as you said, Yaniv, not only is it good for the climate and trying to mitigate the worst outcomes, but it's going to be necessary for cleaning up whatever outcomes are almost inevitable at this point.
The only thing I'd say, Chris, is if I had a magic wand, if any of us had a magic wand, I would probably stop some of the investments that I know aren't making that much of a difference. I would stop all these EV subsidies. I think when you do the math on the mining of the battery and the transport of the battery and all the things, again, this is left-right things. So I do agree with you. you have to be careful what you read, but something like an electric car has to be driven at least 100,000 miles to be net carbon neutral to a combustion engine. And most cars don't get to 100,000 miles.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting thing. I think depending on the source you read, that's anywhere between 100,000 miles and 20,000 miles.
Right,
And,
right.
it's often ideologically motivated. But here's the interesting thing, Emil. I'm not saying that all the investment has been done wisely, but I think it's also worth considering the second order effects. When you subsidize EVs, you are subsidizing, yes, the production of batteries, but you're also subsidizing research into battery technology, supply chain efficiencies, manufacturing efficiencies. So what you end up with at the end of this is like a much stronger battery capability, which I think will be really important. And, it's sort of like the whole like NASA thing where if you look at it as only like a first horizon ROI, sending a man to the moon seems pretty bloody stupid. But all of the technological payoffs from the research that went into that have been incredibly valuable. And so that's not a blank check, but I think it's just a caution to sort of consider the whole picture here. Are we progressing the state of the art in things that matter? Then maybe that is important as well.
I don't disagree. That's a fair point. I just think those subsidies are distributed so broadly right now. Whereas, like, okay, take SpaceX as a continuation of NASA. At least that R&D is concentrated so they can make bigger leaps. So if there was a way to make a bigger leap in battery technology, particularly storage on solar, because the storing of solar power is sort of the problem with solar, not actually converting it into power so that it could be used, right? So
Exactly.
So how do you target R&D on that problem and not distributed by GM, Ford, and all these other people in little crumbs along the way? Yeah, maybe one of them has a breakthrough, but it'd be nice to concentrate bets on big breakthroughs that we need to happen in a way that's like nonlinear as opposed to us just bumping along.
All right, before we wrap up, don't forget the Startup Podcast Pact, which says if you've been listening to a few of our episodes and getting some value, we'd love for you to please share us on your favorite social network and rate us and review us in your favorite podcasting app. And don't forget to check us out on YouTube. It helps us grow the show and help more founders be more successful. All right, guys, great to chat as always.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Chris.
See you guys.
Great to see you as always, man.
Thanks, Emil. Catch you in the next one. This episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta helps businesses get and stay compliant by automating up to 90% of the work for the most in-demand compliance frameworks. With over 200 integrations, you can easily monitor and secure the tools your business relies on. Head to vanta.com/TSP for 20% off their incredible offering and start unlocking extra revenue today.